The Synod on the Family starts to take shape. More dicasteries are on the block for a shake-up after the Council of Cardinals meeting, and we're ready for the Pope's visit to Cuba and the U.S. This and more coming up next. Hello and welcome to this edition of Vatican Connections. We are ready for the Pope to arrive on his trip to Cuba and the U.S. But first, the Synod of Bishops on the Family is less than a month away, and remarkably, the Vatican has already released the full list of who will be participating in that Synod. Before Pope Francis, the list was often released just a few days before the Synod started. Now, for this Synod, the bishops' conferences from around the world elected someone to represent them at the Synod, but the Pope also gets to nominate people he wants to participate. Among those he's tapped to be part of this Synod, Archbishop Blaise Cupich of Chicago, Cardinal Gérald Lacroix of Quebec, Cardinal Timothy Dolan of New York, all of the new cardinals that he created back in February, 2 parish priests from Italy, and Jesuit Father Antonio Spadaro, who is the editor-in-chief of Civiltà Cattolica, the journal published by the Italian Jesuits. And of course, the heads of the Gregorian and Lateran universities in Rome. Now, the heads of the various family ministry offices from dioceses around the world have also been invited to participate, as well as lay people who work with different Catholic movements and organizations that focus on different aspects of family life. Now, the number of women and couples who will be there is still much less than the clergy, but they have been chosen to represent the universality of the Church and the variety of situations that families face today. The Council of Cardinals met again this week at the Vatican. Now, this meeting focused on the 2 new dicasteries that have been proposed and on reviewing a draft of the new Curial Constitution. The cardinals heard a presentation from Cardinal Dionigi Tettamanzi. He is the retired Archbishop of Milan, and he had been asked to study the idea of creating one congregation for laity, family, and life. After hearing his presentation, the cardinals put together a proposal for that new congregation, and now it's up to Pope Francis to decide whether to accept that proposal. The cardinals also discussed the creation of a council for charity, justice, and peace, but no concrete proposal has been submitted yet. They also talked about the way bishops are appointed, what qualifications does a bishop need to have in today's world, what information is looked at when considering a priest to be a bishop, and where does it come from. So we expect more talks to be happening around that issue coming up. As well, they discussed how to deal with sexual abuse cases faster. The Vatican spokesperson, Father Federico Lombardi, told journalists the Vatican has a backlog of cases, just like any other judicial system in the world, and that's what the cardinals are trying to focus on. Turning to the Pope's upcoming trip to Cuba and the United States, we are learning more about what to expect. In Philadelphia, the Pope will get to see a special grotto created just for his arrival. Catholic News Service has more.
Originally, the idea from this piece came from Sister Mary Scullion of Project Home. She knew that Mary Undoer of Knots was one of his favorite paintings, and not being the symbol of universal struggle, perhaps. It's been used in many cultures throughout time. She has always liked that painting as well. So she came and said, what about Mary Undoer of Knots? And then I thought, we don't want to just repaint it. We thought, well, what can we do with these knots?
Archbishop Chapeau in Philadelphia recognizing that the Pope would be here for the World Meeting of Families, he wanted a special emphasis on the poor. And so he established the Committee for Hunger and Homelessness for the World Meeting of Families in honor of Pope Francis's spirit.
To participate, you can, from now until when the Pope comes to Philadelphia, you can submit on a website, mercyandjustice.org. It's all one word. You go there and you push one button, submit not, and type it in. Then we have a scribe here in the studio who will write your email, who will write it onto a prayer slip, and then that will be woven with everyone else's struggle. So it then becomes a collective struggle and prayers for those struggles.
Of the 10 largest cities in the country, Philadelphia is one of the 10 largest cities in the United States. We have the highest poverty rate. I mean, it's, I think the predominant cause of homelessness is poverty. People cannot afford a place to live. People cannot afford the utilities, the other costs associated with maintaining a home. And we work with people who are living on the streets to bring them in, to bring them home.
We have a igloo-like frame that is made out of cedar wood. Within the igloo, on the ground, there will be a reflecting pool where we will have the image of the original painting reflecting on the water. So you can come into the grotto, walk around. It's set up so that you can experience the grotto on the site of the basilica. Everyone may experience something different, but I would want people to experience something significant and something telling in their individual relationship to all of the struggles. And perhaps there's an awareness that comes out of that.
We also learned this week that Pope Francis will give a total of 26 speeches during his trip, and only 4 will be in English. His address to the United Nations will be entirely in Spanish. Pope Francis and Fidel Castro have expressed an interest in meeting each other, but no formal arrangements have been made yet. We do know the Pope will not meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin because the President will not be at the United Nations while the Pope is there. Pope Francis will be in Cuba and the U.S. from September 19th to 28th, and Salt and Light will bring you full coverage of that trip and the World Meeting of Families. Check our website for full broadcast details. Now, the Pope also gave 2 interviews recently, and they were just released this week. The first was to an independent radio station in Argentina called FM Milenio. The Pope has known the journalist Marcelo Figueroa from his days in Buenos Aires. Figueroa hosts a program called Dialogues for Encounter, and this interview was actually more of a discussion about different topics and how they are treated in the Bible. Now, when he was still Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Pope Francis had actually promised to take part in the radio show with his friend Rabbi Abraham Skorka. And Pope Francis, we know, keeps his promises. So the Pope and Figueroa discussed fundamentalism, which the Pope said exists in all religions, but fundamentalists deal in ideas and not reality, he said. They also discussed the Pope's need to be close to people and a priest's role as a bridge builder to Christ. Now, the full audio is available online. Check our blog for a link. The second interview Pope Francis gave was to the Portuguese radio station owned by the Patriarchate of Lisbon and the Bishops' Conference. He talked to Radio Renascença's Vaticanist Aura Miguel for 1 hour. They talked about young people, the refugee crisis, how to give young people hope and the tools to overcome economic crises. They also spoke about the Pope's own prayer life and how he felt after his election and why he's at peace. As expected, Pope Francis gave us some one-liners that we will not soon forget. He told Miguel that he, quote, sleeps like a log, so no worries about him losing sleep over anything. He also said he has a priest come to hear his confession every 2 weeks, more or less, and he said, Until now, I haven't had to call an ambulance for him after hearing my confession. But the Pope also spoke seriously about taking in refugees, and he said Europe currently has a void in the sense that there's a low birth rate and no babies are being born, and there's space for Europe to take in refugees, and it can only be a good thing for the continent. Again, check our blog for links to the full text of that interview in English. And finally, the Vatican museums are one of the highlights for many visitors to the Vatican. Now, since last summer, the gardens at Castel Gandolfo have also been open to the public. But now, at Pope Francis's request, there is a whole new day trip visitors can take that includes both of those places and one very special train ride. CNS has more.
Black smoke and the hissing sound of steam emanate from a train leaving the Vatican, bound for the historic Italian town of Castel Gandolfo. That is where members of the public now have an opportunity to see a new museum housing papal artifacts and portraits, the Italian Renaissance-style Villa Barberini and Papal Gardens, and the hilltop hamlet of Castel Gandolfo, overlooking Lake Albano. Pope Francis coaxed the Vatican to open these sites to visitors, allowing the world to experience this part of the Catholic Church's history and culture. The historic train used to transport reporters and special guests September 11th was just for the preview of the new tour. Sightseers will travel using a more ecologically friendly electric train.
Next up, we're looking at the papal trip to the U.S. and what to expect. Now, I had a chance recently to talk to one expert on the Church in the United States and the Pope's Twitter account. That's coming up. Did you know? When Pope Francis arrives in Cuba, Cardinal Jaime Ortega of Havana will be the only archbishop to have welcomed 3 popes to 1 see. And joining me now is Michael O'Loughlin. He is a writer with Crux, the Boston Globe's website, news site dedicated to all things Catholic. He's also the author of a new book called The Tweetable Pope, and he's here to talk to us about that and the upcoming papal visit to the U.S. Welcome to Vatican Connections, Michael.
Thanks for having me.
So you have written this book, The Tweetable Pope. We've all noticed that Pope Francis tweets regularly, and it's often really striking and witty, and it's tweets that really stay with you throughout the day. And I understand that's what you get into in this book. Tell us more about your book.
Yeah, so what struck me about the Pope's tweets was that they engage us, they inspire us, and they also challenge us. And I think that's why people are responding so passionately to them, is we want some encouragement during the day, but we also, I think, want to be challenged to think about how we can live our lives a little bit more in tune with the gospel. And I mean, people have responded. He's been named the most influential global leader on Twitter 3 years in a row now. He doesn't have, with 21 million followers, he doesn't have as many as even some celebrities like Katy Perry. Right. But he knows how to engage his followers in ways that other global leaders just haven't caught on yet. So he's really taking his message right to the people, and I think that's what's revolutionary about this Pope.
Okay, the message that he's trying to get across is it's not a corporate message, it's not a political message, it's the gospel essentially. So how does that translate? How does he get from 140 characters to something that actually has an impact on someone's life?
Yeah, that's one of the criticisms of Twitter, is that you can't really have a lot of deep conversation in 140 characters. Yeah. But I don't think that's true for a couple of reasons. One, if you go to the Gospels, most of Jesus's most profound messages are well short of 140 characters. It's perfect for Twitter, and I give some examples in the book. But also, I think why this is so useful is that he is kind of getting to the heart of what he wants to say, and he knows that there's not a lot of time. There's so much competition for our attention, whether it's from kind of consumer brands or political messages. There's a lot of people who want us to read what they're saying.
And the book is available in Canada and the U.S.?
Yep, came out September 8th, and it's available at bookstores everywhere.
Wonderful. Changing tracks a little bit, you cover all things Catholic for Crux, which I don't know if many people realize it's actually the Catholic news site of the Boston Globe, essentially.
Sure.
So you've got a unique view on what's going on in the U.S. and in the church in the U.S. We've got the Pope arriving very shortly in the U.S.
Yeah.
What kind of a nation is welcoming this Pope?
It's a nation that very much is in tune with the Catholic Church, at least culturally. A study came out that showed 45% of Americans have some sort of connection to Catholicism, whether they practice or married a Catholic or were raised Catholic. But it's also, it's a divided nation. It's very polarized. You have kind of a conservative wing and a liberal wing, and that's found its way into the church too. The Pope is going to come and offer a message of unity, but the reality is it's a polarized nation and it's also a polarized church. So that's something that he'll have to deal with as he kind of gives his speeches and meets people along the way.
Focusing a little bit more on the U.S. church, I think we've all seen in the news, we've seen examples of the polarization, but we've also read about the increasing Hispanic population. The U.S. church is, by and large, now a Spanish-speaking church. Talk to us about that. What dynamic has that created? What challenges, what opportunities has that created?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating shift. Archbishop Gomez of Los Angeles last week rejected the idea that the future of the Catholic Church in the United States is Hispanic. He says, no, it's already happened. The church has moved from the historical centers in the Northeast and Midwest down to the South and West. Families, young families that go to Mass are largely Hispanic and Spanish-speaking, and increasingly bilingual as well. But it's a change that we haven't seen in the hierarchy yet. That may come with time, but the reality is I think there's a couple different churches that coexist right now in the United States. And Francis the challenge will be to speak to both and to kind of introduce them to each other and make them realize that they're actually part of one church.
From an insider's point of view, what do you think are going to be the highlights, the key moments, the things to watch out for as we follow Pope Francis on his trip to, well, not only the U.S., it's Cuba and the U.S. What do you think the highlights are going to be?
So in the United States particularly, it's heavily scripted and security concerns are daily. We get updates that there's just a lot of crowd control. So for a Pope who likes to go off script and be spontaneous, that's going to prove difficult, I think. I don't know if he'll be able to venture out to greet people where some of the best moments, I think, come from. But it'll be fascinating to see a Pope address the U.S. Congress. That's never happened before. And he'll be challenging both parties, whether it's about immigration and the environment or about life issues. He has a message that I think will affirm a lot of people in their work, but also challenge them to consider how they respond to church teaching. When he goes to the United Nations, he'll be speaking about the environment, and he'll be speaking to the heads of more than 80 countries. It'll be, there's not a bigger global platform than that for him to get his message about caring for the environment out there.
Do you think we'll see him go off script?
I expect so. I mean, I hope so. As we've seen him do, he puts aside the prepared remarks and kind of speaks from the heart, often in Spanish. So there's a lot that the Catholic Church in the United States wants to hear. So if we can kind of get him off script and hear what he's really thinking, I think people will respond very well to that.
My last question, just very briefly, we've been talking a lot about how it's a papal trip to the U.S. and it's easy to forget that it's Cuba and the U.S.
Yeah.
How has that been received in the U.S., the fact that he's going to Cuba first?
It's a political message, I think, showing that we're neighbors, and while the two nations haven't always got along, I think he's saying, you're so close, you have to kind of be in dialogue. He's all about dialogue. He helped the United States and Cuba kind of come to an agreement to end years of not speaking to each other.
Yeah.
And for this Pope, what he does is the message often, so he's showing that we have to be in dialogue and talking to one another.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for making time for us. All the best with the book, The Tweetable Pope. We'll all be running out to get a copy.
Great, thanks.
Great. Well, Pope Francis scaled back his public appearances this week, but let's take a look at what he did do. On Monday, the Council of Cardinals met at the Vatican, and Pope Francis took part in that meeting, which ran until Wednesday. And that's a big part of the reason that there were few public papal events this week. On Wednesday was the general audience, and Catholic News Service has more for us.
Esistono molti luoghi comuni, a volte persino offensivi, sulla donna tentatrice che ispira al male. Invece c'è spazio per una teologia della donna che sia all'altezza di questa benedizione di Dio per lei e per la generazione. Cristo, nato da donna, è la carezza di Dio sulle nostre piaghe, sui nostri sbagli, sui nostri peccati. Ma Dio ci ama come siamo e vuol portarci avanti con questo progetto. E la donna è quella più forte che porta avanti questo progetto.
Now, Thursday was a busy day. Pope Francis met with young consecrated men and women who were taking part in an event offered for the Year of Consecrated Life. The same day, he also met with the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, Xavier Bettel. They discussed the relationship between church and state and the role that religious freedom plays in keeping society together. They also discussed migration and the need to provide assistance to refugees and displaced peoples. After that, Pope Francis met with people taking part in a meeting of Cor Unum, the church's charity arm. The meeting was focused on the humanitarian crisis in Syria and Iraq. Now, he said in Syria and Iraq, evil destroys buildings and infrastructure, but especially the conscience of man. And in the name of Jesus, the church must respond to that evil with good. For Catholics, that means strengthening the bonds that unite us to other Christian churches and working together to help the region. And on Saturday, Pope Francis was set to take off for Cuba. And there were just a couple of nominations this week. Let's take a look at what they were. Bishop James V. Johnston is moving from Springfield, Cape Girardeau to Kansas City, St. Joseph. The previous bishop of Kansas City, St. Joseph, Robert Finn, resigned about 5 months ago after he was found guilty of mishandling an abusive priest. Bishop Johnston will be installed in Kansas on November 4th. And Rome has a new auxiliary. Father Angelo Di Donatis has been named auxiliary bishop. You might remember his name. He actually preached the meditations for the Curia's spiritual exercises for Lent 2014.
That Cuba be home to all Cubans and for all Cubans, a place in which justice and freedom coexist in a climate of peaceful fraternity. These were just some of the words Pope Benedict XVI spoke to the faithful and all citizens of Cuba at Havana's Jose Marti International Airport on Wednesday, following a private meeting with Cuba's communist revolutionary leader and former President Fidel Castro. Fidel's younger brother, the current Cuban president, Raul Castro, attended the farewell ceremony and addressed words of gratitude to Pope Benedict. In his own remarks at the leave-taking, Pope Benedict also stressed the suffering of the Cuban people because of the embargo and reiterated that no one should be hindered in their fundamental freedoms.
Well, that's all for this edition of Vatican Connections. Now, next week, instead of our usual programming, our team will be in Philadelphia bringing you live coverage of the Pope's visit to the United States. Vatican Connections will return at the usual time on October 2nd. Until then, check our blog or Twitter for regular updates. From everyone here, thanks for watching and see you next time.